For the SOPA Awards 2020, we are exclusively joined by Michael Vidler, Vidler & Company, the internationally acclaimed human rights lawyer, and very brave you are too. Thanks for joining us for this
Thank you.
interview.
Thank you for the invitation for this SOPA Awards.
Well, where do we start? Let's face it, the national security law. Let's go straight to the heart of it, Michael. I mean, let's face it, compared to the rest of Asia, Hong Kong has enjoyed a relatively free reign overall on what journalists can report. How has the NSL changed that?
I would say the NSL poses an existential threat for freedom of the press in Hong Kong. This is a law that announces its superiority over local law. It includes basic law, Bill of Rights, and all the protections that affords. It's a law that is extrajudicial, so it applies to people who haven't even stepped into Hong Kong. It announces 4 criminal offences with very lengthy prison sentences, and the language that the law is drafted in, the breadth of that, and the lack of clarity of that, and the lack of definition of that, and in fact the fact that the interpretation of the law is in the hands of the NPCSC and not local courts, means that each one of those offences, the local journalists or international journalists could fall foul of the law inadvertently. For instance, you would think, for instance, just discussing things like independence, you would fall foul of it. No, it could be as such if you are covering a story about the conflicts over the extent of territorial borders in the South China Sea. That could bring you under, part of the succession provisions. If you are challenging or you are doing an article about human rights abuse by Hong Kong government, you could be prosecuted if the prosecution takes the stance of, that is a false story, it's defamatory, and it impacts upon the Hong Kong government. Again, potentially you could fall foul of the provisions. But it goes further than that. It sets up an organ of state, the Office of National Security, for which there is no oversight in Hong Kong.
Isn't it like the other countries, Myanmar, Thailand? You can go right across Southeast Asia and you can get NSLs everywhere. So do you think that Hong Kong is now more or less falling in line with the rest of the region?
I think.
Or is that?
I think the point is that those countries, those regimes may be problematic and repressive, but this law comes with the full force of the People's Republic of China. So it's repression on steroids. We have a situation where you can have trial without jury in secret. You can be extrajudicially renditioned back to China to face trial or who knows what. And there is, the extended powers of warrantless wiretapping, search and arrest. There are a multitude of aspects of it which are, deeply troubling, and it's clearly a watershed moment for Hong Kong.
Do you think there is a far greater risk for local Hong Kong Chinese journalists than there are for international journalists who may lose their visa and then be sent back to where they came from, as opposed to the local ones who face far more serious repercussions?
I think the risk is the same for all. I think part of this is that people, not just journalists and lawyers, but bankers, they have to understand the full scope of this law, and the very fact that the lack of concision and the breadth of the provisions and the lack of definition make it so problematic. But I think that local journalists are going to feel the brunt of the law more than international organisations, because ultimately those international organisations will leave.
So bringing me to the next question then is the responsibility of the larger banners, the international banners. Then we can go to a victim mallet situation.
Yeah.
How important is that larger banners stand up and say okay, as opposed to the more local, regional newspapers or broadcasters?
I think it's vital. I mean, if you are a media organisation that heralds and proclaims freedom of the press, then when you are put in a position where a decision is made in relation to your organisation and one of your journalists that impinges upon the rule of law, it is incumbent upon that organisation to challenge that decision and do so in the most effective way, which at the moment is through the courts. And to do so, you are condemning the smaller, non-banner titles, perhaps the local media, to the full force of this law. And it's important to remember that it's not just the provisions of this particular law. There is a paradigm shift in climate. The local government, the Hong Kong government, is already using what were previously benign local legislation in a far more interventionist manner. For instance, with visas, denying visas. There was a recent piece by the FCC regarding that.
Delayed, right? Delayed by 4
Delayed
months.
and denial.
Okay.
I mean, delay after a while is a de facto denial. So it is, in my view, incumbent upon these organisations to do so. And you mentioned the FT and Victor Mallet. I think that was a watershed moment that, or put it like this, a missed opportunity, because the Financial Times had the opportunity to put the brakes on encroachment. And if they had done so back in 2018, I don't think we would have been faced with the actions that have been taken now impacting on the New York Times.
But if the FT was sitting here asking the question, they may say, what would be, obviously in their interest is for everybody else, but I mean, the pushback for them would have been quite intense if they had spoken up at that time.
Well,
given that Victor his visa was revoked as when he was sent to Paris or went to Paris, but that was of course the FCC talk that he just hosted. He happened to be the host of it as opposed to organising it.
The point is that in a court decision, then it is sort of on the court. The decision, the sort of the blame, the responsibility is on the court. And the court in Hong Kong, up to now, has been robust enough and independent enough to make decisions according to the law, under its duty to uphold the rule of law and the basic law and the Bill of Rights. But unless organisations that are impacted take that action, then there's nothing you can do. FCC didn't have the locus, didn't have the interest to be able to challenge that decision. So it's for these individual organisations to do so. And there may have been commercial pushback in China, but I mean, I'm doing cases that are challenging the Hong Kong government all the time. The banks joined in the intervention for the QT case on the recognition of same-sex marriage from abroad, and those banks didn't get pushback from China. I know it's slightly different, but
that might change that. Your cases might be far more resistance, pressure, for want of a better word, that you may experience now than you would have done, for example, 2 years ago with the new NSL. So for you, it would be a much steeper uphill climb.
Well, certainly for those which are deemed to be sort of political, protest orientated, yes. And we found that over the last 2 years. This isn't the national security law has, it has totally changed things. But before that, it's been 2 years of decline. There's been real challenges to the rule of law in Hong Kong. The police have been, it could be said, out of control. And there's been failings in the restraint of the police, be it the commissioner of the police or the lower courts, to not grant search warrants which appear to have been complete abuse of process. So there have been failings which have been a concern.
In Hong Kong, Michael, prides itself on the rule of law. I mean, you hear it everywhere, right?
Yeah.
I mean, how safe is that right now? I mean, do you see that being eroded over the course of time?
This national security law runs roughshod over the rule of law. The former president of the Supreme Court of the UK, former Lord Chief Justice and Master of the Rolls, Tom Bingham, or Lord Bingham, set up a centre for rule of law, and he set out eight principles. And if you sort of run through those principles, you can see how this particular law fails the test. The fact that decisions on law should be determined by the courts rather than on discretion. It fails on that because interpretation ultimately goes to the NPCSC. The fact that laws should, in a jurisdiction with the rule of law, should protect fundamental human rights. Well, it fails that test because the national security law supersedes those laws which we have in Hong Kong which protect fundamental human rights. There's a provision or a principle that jurisdictions with the rule of law must uphold their international obligations. Well, the very fact that you have these provisions and the content of this law would tend to run contrary to the joint agreement, which has treaty status in terms of the one country, two system principles. So on a number of these very core principles, this national security law fails the test.
So then if you are the FT or anybody else, and you're listening to this interview now, why would you want to stay in Hong Kong? If the rule of law is being eroded, and everything you've just said is a pretty terrifying prospect, so why not go to Korea like the New York Times have done partly, or Singapore? Why would you want to stay here? What's your message to the publications? What, in sense of stay here, here's the reason why, but also what legal recourse do they have going forward, apart from hiring you?
I think it's a philosophical question. It's a very difficult question that any individual or company has to make. But I think we're living in historic times, which I think the next generation will look back on and be asking the question, what did you do at this time? And will individuals or will corporations be able to put their hand on heart, or in the in corporate space, their corporate reputation? Will they be able to say with pride, yes, that we did our best to maintain the rights that we benefited under during our time in Hong Kong, and we didn't just up sticks and go? Now it's, as I said, it's a difficult question because there's good reason why some companies may go, because they very much feel that the requirements in the national security law, which requires provision of information, for instance, to publishers, from publishers, are such that if they were served a notice, they would have to comply, or all their officers and their staff would be at risk. And that's a very real risk. And so I can understand why some organisations have done so. But on the other hand, there's perhaps a moral responsibility to maintain the line.
In the same way that, for example, in Myanmar, Thailand, Philippines, or right across Southeast Asia, some also stayed. Some may have left, but some also stayed. So if you were the Chinese Ministry of Information, and I was sitting here, and you'd say, well, hang on a minute, we're just like everybody else now, as I mentioned before. So there is a reason to say, as long as you don't cross the red line, as it were, and get invited for tea.
The problem is,
you can still
where is
report,
that? Where is that line?
Well, you have to find that out.
That's the problem. This is where we have changed so much, because the
that's
lack
part of journalism.
clarity.
That's part of the journalism experience. You
Well,
have to find the red line, and when you hit against it, you step back. But you just report within those, as they do in other countries, not just in Asia, but Russia and beyond.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I think we have to, in Hong Kong, remember that there's journalists in the Philippines who are facing death squads.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly.
We don't have that here yet. But we have to remember it's in context. But Hong Kong has prided itself in a place where the rule of law applies in Asia. And that's not something that could have been said in the Philippines. So it's an apple and pears.
Very brave what they do, reporting every day, and they're living in it.
Yeah,
they're living in it
absolutely.
daily.
Absolutely. You've got an immense respect for these people who really put their life and limb. But we've had journalists being physically attacked here in Hong Kong. I'm not talking about the police attacks.
Okay,
I'm talking about vigilante, triad-related attacks.
Okay.
We've had media magnates that are harassed, if I can put it like that. So we are going that way. That's my fear.
What's the latest on? So you mentioned police, the HKJA review of the police treatment of journalists. Where are we with that? And do you think are we in the right direction, or is it again changing?
No. I mean, this was part of my concern with the cracks in the protections of the rule of law before this law came into effect. And part of that is the delays that were experienced in getting important cases to court and getting judgments, which could have then guided the police and the government on the legality of their actions before things got out of hand. And so, that's why I think the HKJA decision was important. We filed that in October. There were 2 hearings in February and April, and when we don't have a decision.
And that was the young lady who lost her right eye, right? The
No,
Indonesian journalist
this is
you represented.
No, this is the more systemic challenge.
Right.
This related to we gave as examples 19 instances of events that took place or affected journalists. So there are 3 parts of the challenge. One is the failure of the police to facilitate and not hinder lawful journalistic activity. Secondly, the failure of the police to wear unique identification to allow for accountability. And thirdly, the lack of an independent mechanism in Hong Kong for the investigation of serious complaints against the police. So the first limb, which is perhaps sort of the one that people would grasp a little bit easier, we cited, or we used instances of 19 different journalists, and we specifically chose all of those because there was no hint of them being intermingled. I know there was some talk and chatter about, look, are they established journalists, or maybe they're too intermingled with the protest. All of these were established journalists, not intermingled with protesters. All were wearing clear visibility and declared press. Yeah. All had their credentials on display, and they experienced a series of actions which we say encompassed the sort of activities which we wanted the court to determine what amounted to hindering or not facilitating lawful journalistic activity. And that ranged from just being abusive to journalists to putting up shields to obstruct visibility, to use strobe lights against cameras, to things like assaults with batons, pepper spray, baton rounds. You cite the case of the Indonesian journalist.
Who lost her right eye.
Yeah.
You represented her, right?
Yeah, but that case isn't about that. This is about the systemic problem that increased from June 2019, and seemed to have got out of hand. And that's why the challenge was, in my view, it still is so important, because it allows the court to give guidance, to make a declaration as to the lawfulness of this conduct. And the problem is that if that takes place after the events, then it's all happened. And indeed, the protests are finished now. In fact, they had finished after the district council elections. So it's the need for timely
There's also a comparison
challenge.
to the US, what happened in the US with George Ford and the whole very intense coverage of the brutality, what we saw. So that may have taken a sting out of the tail.
It's extraordinary. We look at what's going on in the US, what happened to him, and yet there's clear photographic evidence of the restraint of protesters using exactly the same techniques, which led to the death of George Floyd. But I think my point is that unless organisations take prompt action, then there's nothing that can, these rights will be eroded. I want to give you an example of, for instance, in contrast to the FT, for instance, was what happened with CNN and Jim Acosta when his credentials were withdrawn from the White House. You know, in that case, the CNN went to court within days, and they had a decision within weeks. So immediately, that encroachment on press freedom was nipped in the bud, was stopped.
But can you realistically compare the US to Hong Kong?
Yeah.
Now?
Yes. We have constitutional protections, or we certainly had them.
That's the thing, you had them. I mean,
we still do in regards to these visa decisions, for instance. We still do have those protections. I mean, these refusals of visas are not under the national security law. These are utilising the previously benign legislation that we had as a weapon. And for me, that's the immediate threat that media organisations are going to face, not the full force of national security law. It's going to be the use of, for instance, visas, and to undermine staffing, so that you can't bring in the reporters you want. And this is where I think the FCC gets the message wrong. It collates to China. And, I mean, perhaps it's clear that this comes from the PRC, the decision. But it is the immigration department that has made these decisions. And it is the immigration department that is subject to judicial review and can be judicially reviewed. And the law on the judicial system is such that it continues to be strident and independent. And I think these decisions can be challenged still.
So the FCC are taking the wrong line then, you think?
In my view, the FCC should be saying, why aren't these organisations challenging them in court?
Right.
In Hong Kong.
Right.
Because although pressure might be brought to bear from China, ultimately it's the Hong Kong government which is acting, and it is the Hong Kong government that can be held, or should be held to account, by the courts.
Do you feel under severe pressure? Just as you know.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
But you're not going to leave, are you?
No, I've been here for over 25 years. This is my home. My family's from here. My wife's from here. Kids were born here. I'm invested in Hong Kong. Hong Kong's my home, and I'm damned if I'm going to be driven out. Whether I actually have to leave as a refugee in due course, I don't know. But that hasn't come across. Well, that decision hasn't had to be made yet.
Final message then, really, to journalists. What is your message for journalists? I mean, saying what you just said, very brave, you're staying here, you're going nowhere by your choice. I mean, what's your message to journalists who are, or indeed publications who are thinking twice?
I think that the major concern, this is going to result in self-censorship. So the big message is, don't self-censor, otherwise you might as well go. And stay if you possibly can, because Hong Kong needs good quality journalists to report on what is going on, because if you follow the mentality of Amnesty International from the 1970s, the torchlight of scrutiny, a government knowing that someone is looking on and reporting about the activities, all their wrongdoing, is a hindrance. China does not like to be seen as a international player that doesn't abide by the international rules. It has wanted to portray itself as a world leader, and it doesn't like it when people call them out, call out the government. And if people don't do that, then we might as well give up and go.
Thank you much indeed, Michael Vidler.